Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Ginny Dietrich.
And today we're going to talk about, I've got nothing cutesy. We're just going to talk about what's the future of media relations agencies.
Wow.
Right after this.
That was okay.
Boring, but accurate. Maybe I should have said something like, stop the presses.
Not a thing anymore.
But that's what we're going to be talking about.
It actually drives me nuts. This is a pet peeve when people call it press release and press conference. Not how it's done anymore. It's a news release and a news conference. Drives me nuts.
But if we sat here and made a list of all of your pet peeves, Jenny.
Oh, it'd be a lot.
This would be a really long episode.
Yeah, it'd probably be like 2 hours long. Sure.
I mean, me personally, I have no pet peeves.
You do too. We talked about it a couple weeks ago.
Yes. Well, if we ever get bored, we can do an episode where we just do nothing but list our pet peeves. Then we'll have enough content that we'll just split it up into 52 episodes.
It's terrible.
We'll call it the Year of Pet Peeves.
The Year of Pet Peeves. I like it. Let's do it. That one.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying on those. I guess I'm just not nearly as.
Oh yeah, it drives me nuts.
Yeah. But what we actually are going to talk about there are a lot of what I would call traditional PR agencies, and they focus primarily on media relations. And so the question that I get asked often by folks like that is, look, we know that, that media is having all sorts of challenges that are only getting worse year by year. We know that focusing exclusively on media relations may not be the best bet, but we're not quite sure how do we expand our services in a smart way so that we're not just fumbling around in the dark or trying to be all things to all people. So, as the author of the PESO model, which is ideally where most agencies should get to,
yep.
What's the first step that they should be taking to think about how they expand that circle of services?
So on March 14th, my Spin Sucks podcast episode is about contributed content. And I think contributed content is one of the most underused tactics that we have in our toolbox, because it's people, for some reason, PR professionals tend to shy away from it. Maybe it's because they don't have the budget, because once you place contributed content, you have to, of course, write it, unless you have a subject matter expert at your client's organization that can do it. But usually the agency is writing the content or producing the content. It might be because it's scary. It might be because you're asking for a link inside your content. Like, there's all sorts of reasons that agencies don't do contributed content, but it is one of the easier ways, I think, of doing media relations. You have control of the message. You have control of the link, the anchor text. You have control of the link that you insert into the content that drives back to your client's website. You control all of that. With traditional media relations, you don't control any of that. And so kind of shifting that thinking, that mindset to say, okay, we're going to do our traditional media relations and we're going to do some contributed content, which starts to get you on the path to doing owned media. And once you get on that path, it's a little bit easier to say to clients, okay, well, now we'd like to do blog posts or white papers or, whatever it happens to be, videos or podcasts, whatever it happens to be. But contributed content is a really easy way for a traditional media relations firm or professional to get into doing more content marketing or owned media to be able to fulfill a PESO model program.
So it's interesting that you suggest contributed content first before owned content. So actually, before we do that, why don't we define what you mean by contributed content? Because I think it means different things to different people. Are we talking about traditional op-eds? Are we talking about pay to play on websites? What kind of contributed content are you talking about?
No, I would consider it more earned. So no pay to play. If you're going to do Forbes Communications Council or something like that, I'd probably consider that in there, even though you are paying a little bit for that. But really, pretty much every trade and business publication on earth takes contributed content. There was a study recently done that shows that 97% of website editors take contributed content. So it's content that you've written because you're an expert, or your client is a subject matter expert in something. And it defines greatly with the readers of the publication. So now your client, in this case, is a bylined author for that publication. So like early in my agency life, I wrote for Crane's Chicago Business, and I had a byline every month. And I was contributing the content. I didn't get paid for it, but it helped me build my brand, especially among organizations in Chicago. So it's that kind of thing. It's still earned. You're still earning the opportunity to get that in there, but you're producing the content yourself.
Right. And so therefore it's more thought leadership as opposed to advertorial.
Correct.
And so I think that's something that's important for folks to keep in mind, because I think a lot of times folks think of contributed content and think, oh, I can basically just, write a subtle advertisement for my own business. And that's not what this is.
It's not.
Particularly if it's on the earned.
Yeah. Like we accept one contributed piece a week. And if somebody sends us something, A, that's been published elsewhere, we knock it out. And B, if it's self-promotional or salesy, we either ask them to rewrite it or we tell them we decline it. So, and we try to stay up at the same standards that many of the, media outlet editors do as well. Like they're not going to accept content that's self-promotional or salesy. They're not going to accept content that's been published somewhere else. They're going to accept content that's means something to their readers, viewers, listeners. It's expert content. It's something that they're not able to get on their own. So they either don't have the expertise with the reporters they have internally to be able to do that, or they don't have the network, or whatever it happens to be, but they're looking for content that is really, it's written from an expert's perspective, and it's case studies and it's research and it's insights.
So then now let's get back to the question I had earlier, which is, so why focus on contributed first before owned? What's the logic there? Because I think some people might say, well, owned I control. I don't have to worry about the placement. I just kind of can churn it out and have something there. So what's the logic from a service perspective of getting your clients to go contributed first?
I would prefer you go owned first, but I think that's a harder leap, especially if your clients are not doing that yet. Right. So it's a lot harder from a budgetary planning perspective, because it's not cheap to say, okay, well, now we're going to add this on. It's an easier sell on or up. What's the word I want?
Upsell.
Thank you. I was like uplift. That's not right. It's easier to do that with contributed content because they see it as in the media relations realm. And because you're going to actually produce the content for them, you're going to be able to get an incremental increase in your budget. And it's easier for clients to absorb that. If you go in and you say, okay, well, now we're going to do the PESO model, they go, whoa, and it's not as easy. So that's the only reason. Like if I were designing this entirely from scratch, I would do the PESO model, and I would start with owned, and then I would go shared, earned, and paid. But that's the reason that I would start with contributed content, because clients tend to see it still in that media relations realm.
Right. It's more logical from a client perspective. I think the other thing is that it's also logistically simpler because it's something that you as a PR agency would have more direct control over, right, as opposed to perhaps, if it is having to deal with owned for a blog or something like that, or shared on social, you may then have to start dealing with other departments within the client that you didn't have to deal with previously, particularly if it comes to shared, right? When you're starting to deal with social, everybody seems to want their fingers in that pie, but nobody really wants to do the work.
Right.
But they all
That's exactly right.
So it gets messy. And so I think the advantage of looking towards contributed first is everything that you said, but also just the logistical headache. Even if someone's already got, social accounts, it's a lot easier to not have to deal with them unless you're the one. If you control it, and I agree with you. I think that the owned shared first always makes more sense because you do have complete control over it. You don't have to worry about, well, is this going to get published tomorrow or next week, or
8 weeks
it doesn't
from now,
fit.
or
Or is it going to be published at all?
Yep.
You also don't have to deal with the challenges. A lot of publications will not allow your links to continue to function in contributed content. So they may take the links out. And so I always tell people, don't create contributed content with the mindset that it's all about the link, because you may not have it. You have to have value there for yourself beyond the link.
But I will tell you that in our experience, it's a lot easier to get the link to stay in when you're doing contributed content than it is if you're pitching a story. So if you're pitching a story and they do an interview or a feature, they almost never will include your link. But in contributed content, I'd say about 95% of the time it stays in. If the content is really good and valuable and, demonstrates that expertise, for sure. Because you're usually working with a different type of editor than you would with so you're working with a web editor in some cases. And the web editor understands that the link is valuable to both you and them.
Right. Exactly. And so if I'm a traditional media relations agency and I'm looking to start down this path, do I pick an existing client and try to convince them to go the contributed content route? Do I try to find a new client who's interested in going that? How do I best methodically go about this? What's my highest probability of success and my lowest risk, I guess I should ask?
Well, this is the favorite answer, but it depends, of course, right? I would think, it really does depend. For many of our clients, we just slowly started to add that stuff on when we started doing the PESO model. We said, okay, well, now we're going to add on blogging, and now we're going to add on podcasting, and it just sort of grew. But then with all new clients, that's just what we did. Like anybody who calls today and says we want PR, I always dig into what that means, because it usually means they just want media relations, and we won't do that work. I always direct them somewhere else. So if that's all they want, then we won't do that. But this is 10 years running now. So it's not like that happened immediately in the first few months where I was like, okay, we're not doing just media relations anymore. Like we had to slowly transition our existing clients and then bring the new ones on in a full PESO model program. So It depends on how you're structured and whether or not your existing clients are willing to increase the work that you're doing together.
Mm-hmm. So now we've added contributed content. What should be next? Owned or shared?
Owned.
So that's easy if an organization already has a blog or something like that, because now it's just a matter of creating the content. But let's say that someone doesn't have an existing platform that you can use. Would you still advocate for that before social?
I would. And you don't have to necessarily do a blog. For one client, they didn't have a blog. We started with them in October and we launched a podcast, and it's killing it. I mean, they're killing it. Their competitors are starting to copy too, which is kind of fun to see. Makes them mad, but I think it's fun. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a blog, but it can be something, it could be a podcast. It could be a video series. I have a woman on my team, our social media manager, who loves storytelling with pictures and videos. So if we get her out in the field talking to customers, she comes back with stuff that you're just like, wow. I mean, her brain, she used to be a television producer, so her brain works in that way. And so we look for opportunities to get her out in the field to be able to do those kinds of things. And it may, in some cases, it ends up being testimonials or case studies. In some cases, it ends up being just a really great reel on Instagram. So you have to kind of think about it more holistically than just a blog.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the advantages to going with something other than a blog is that you can often set them up on other platforms, so you don't have to deal with some of the internal rigmarole at clients that you would need to do. I mean, you can certainly do that with a blog as well, but you're probably going to get a little bit more resistance from the in-house marketing or IT people over that versus something like a podcast that you can easily set up and host somewhere else, or a video series that you can put on YouTube or something like that, where you've got you can more easily spin up something with your control over it without having to run all the traps internally at your client that can really slow things down.
Yes, and I would also recommend that you run those traps. So don't wait to run the traps and then launch. Like, go ahead and launch and get it started, but run the traps, because you want that living on their website.
Absolutely.
At some point. So I would fight that fight. That's a battle worth fighting. But don't wait to fight that battle to get it launched, for sure.
Right. And it's one of those things too, where as you start having success with it, it makes the internal battles easier, right? Because, yes. if you go to management and say, look, we've got all these listeners on the podcast, or these great guests, or, any measures of success that you come up with, they can use that to beat down the IT department or whoever is resisting putting it on me. And I don't mean to pick on my friends in IT. I have a lot of friends in IT. I have overseen IT departments, but they are often an obstacle, shall we say, in these cases. A necessary evil that organizations often have. Yeah. So now let's say as an agency, I want to go down this path, and certainly contributed content that's pretty much within the wheelhouse of the capabilities of the team that I probably have. I probably need to get a little bit smarter on, how to find those opportunities and that kind of thing. But if I start going down the route of podcast or video or social media, I may not have the internal skill sets. So how should I go about doing that? I mean, I probably don't want to go out and hire someone full time who
Right.
is
Right.
a podcast, video, or social media expert. So how do
Right.
I start offering those services and test the waters?
Well, I would find contractors who can do that work. And I like to work with solopreneurs, not necessarily agencies, because my idea is that if we're testing out a new idea or a new project with a client, if it works, I want to eventually hire that person full time. So I look for people who are freelancing or solopreneurs, but don't necessarily want to continue to run their own business forever. So I'm looking for people like that. And I always, they go through an interview process the same as anybody else would, and then I give them a project and see how it does. And if we like to work together and it works out, then we continue to add on and add on and add on. And that's actually how I found my social media manager. I actually posted in SpinSucks probably 2 years ago that I was looking for somebody with social media experience, with a sports emphasis for a client that we were working with. And we hired her specifically to work on this client. And I will never let her go. She's so good. She's so good. But that's how I found her. And she was probably working 10 or 15 hours a week on this specific client. And then we just grew our relationship together over the last couple of years. So it wasn't immediate either.
Well, I think that's important for agencies to understand. They can and should test things before they decide to fully commit to a new service offering, to make sure that it really does fit with the clients that they have, that people are willing to pay, that they are. I mean, one of the mistakes I see agencies make is they offer services for free to test them. With a new client.
No.
The problem is you haven't actually verified that it's working, right? I mean, so you have developed some experience, so that's a good thing. But if someone hasn't actually had to pay for that service, then you haven't proven that you actually have market fit.
Yes.
Because it may just be that they said, sure, it was free. Why not? And so you need to charge as if they were. It's a common thing. You know this, right? And I understand the impulse because you want to get the experience. And to some extent, you sit there and say, well, until I know I can do it, I don't want to charge someone for it. But look, if you charge them and you don't manage to do it up to expectations, just refund them.
Right.
But don't tell them in advance that they're getting it
it's
for free.
Right. Right.
Because
one of the things I like to do when we're testing stuff out is, instead of giving it to free to clients, test it on ourselves. I mean,
yes,
that's how the blog came. That's how SpinSucks the blog came about. That's how the podcast came about. That's how everything came about, because we tested it on ourselves first. So if you're going to pay somebody to help you do this, then pay them to do it on your own agency. Figure out what the pros and cons are, where you're weak, where you need help, and where your strengths are, and then go sell it to clients.
Right. And obviously you would like to get results for your agency out of that work, but if you don't, you still figured out whether it works. So, so you have to be, because I've seen some agencies tell me, well, we don't really need, this for what we do. So it's kind of overkill. Who cares? It's overkill, but you're learning in the process and you're testing it on yourself. So the risk is basically zero.
Yes.
Because it's not like unless you're creating really crazy videos, you're probably not going to do anything that is truly damaging to your brand. It may not produce any results.
Right.
But that's different than causing damage. And if you're not causing damage, the risk is zero. So try them out. By all means, use contractors. I mean, this is one of the things that I have a hard time wrapping my head around, because a lot of agencies push back and say, well, I can't afford to hire a social media manager or a podcast producer. No, you can't and shouldn't, because you haven't even figured out if it's the right thing.
Right.
Because, there are different ways that, we've talked about in this episode some of the ways that we would go about expanding, but there are other ways. You could get into influencer marketing, or you could get into events, or there's all sorts of other areas that you could expand into, but this is probably the most logical path for a traditional media relations agency based on the skills that we've generally seen in those agencies in our experience.
And I will say, from a podcast production standpoint, video production, design work, all of those things, we use agencies for that. And I have a great network. So if you're looking for people or agencies to help with that, because we're not going to bring that internally.
Right.
We'll never bring those skills internally. So I work with agencies. So if you're looking for people like that, let me know, because I have worked really hard for the last 10 years to build a great network of agencies, freelancers, and solopreneurs that are really good at their jobs. And, there may be some I'm willing to share and some I'm not.
Right. Well, and the thing to remember is that as an agency, your job is to do things that produce the right results for the client. Whether that's through in-house staff, contractors, partnerships, it doesn't matter. And if you're producing results and you're the one who is coming up with the strategy and managing the process and all of that, you will be rewarded for that by your ideal clients. And so you don't need to worry about, well, I can't do that entirely on staff. So fine, just charge appropriately for it.
Right.
As long as you're charging appropriately, it doesn't matter how the work is getting done.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It does not matter. I actually was just thinking about this morning because a client of mine was like, oh, I just don't think, and I'm like, you don't have to do the work. Clients only care if the work gets done and if it's done well. They don't care who does it. They don't.
Right.
They don't care.
While we're at it, just a sidebar here, and it's sort of on topic, but it's a little bit not. It bugs me that when agencies are working with contractors or other agencies, they like bend over backwards to hide this from the client. That makes everybody's life so much more difficult.
Yes.
If you're partnering up with an agency to do the podcast production, just let your client know that.
Yep.
If your client decides that you're not worthwhile and they're going to work directly with that podcast production thing, you weren't providing any value outside of that anyway.
Right.
So the problem you need to solve is not that your client went behind your back, but that you weren't producing enough value that they saw a reason to continue to work with you.
That's right.
And when you try to hide this, when you try to create white label arrangements with other agencies or contractors, you just make the logistics so much harder, because now you can't give out their direct email address. So maybe you're creating an internal one that forwards, and that's messy. And then they got to remember not to respond through. Just stop. Just let everybody know what's going on. As long as the client is getting results, that's what matters.
They don't care. They really don't care. And if you go on vacation, or as we've talked about in the past, if something happens to you and you can't do the work, they have people that they can go to. But if you've hidden that from them, all of a sudden there's nowhere for them to go. And either you spend your whole vacation working because you haven't been honest about that, or, if you get hit by a bus in other fashions, then, there are great opportunities for you to just be honest about it. And they don't care. Right. They really don't.
So the bottom line is the future of media relations agencies is bright as long as you're looking at other ways to serve your clients. Hopefully we've given you a few ideas that you can use as you're contemplating how to do that. And if you have questions, by all means, reach out to either one of us. We have lots of ideas.
We do.
And connections and resources and that kind of stuff. And if you're not subscribed to Spin Sucks already, you should be, because that's what a lot of the content's about. With that,
thank you.
I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends.